Welcome, dear listeners, to a delightful new mystery set in the charming village of St. Mary Mead. Join our beloved Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and gentle wisdom, as she unravels a puzzling crime in Miss Marple and the murder in the lantern room. Settle in with a cup of tea, and let us transport you to a world of cozy intrigue and clever deductions. Chapter 1. The Light Goes Out. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, was a place where time seemed to linger, as if reluctant to disturb the rhythm of its quiet days. In the autumn of 1952, the elms along the high street stood cloaked in amber, their leaves drifting lazily to the cobbled paths below. The air carried the crisp scent of bonfires and the faint sweetness of apples from Mr. Pye's orchard. At the heart of the village, just beyond the vicarage with its ivy-draped walls, stood Willow Cottage, a quaint two-story home with a curious glass-walled lantern room perched atop its roof like a crown. By evening, its glow was a familiar beacon, for its owner, Mr. Percival Hawthorne, was often seen there, peering through his telescope or poring over botanical journals. Miss Jane Marple, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, sat in her parlor at Mead Cottage, her knitting needles clicking with the steady cadence of a metronome. Her window, framed by lace curtains, offered a perfect view of the village green, where children scampered, and Mrs. Price from the post office bustled with her usual urgency. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unclouded despite her years, missed nothing. She had noted, with her characteristic precision, that Mr. Hawthorne's lantern room had been dark for 2 evenings, a departure from his routine. "Most peculiar," she murmured to herself, her needles pausing as she glanced toward Willow Cottage. Mr. Hawthorne is not one to miss his stargazing. Percival Hawthorne, a retired botanist and amateur astronomer, was a man of predictable habits. A widower of 60, he had come to St. Mary Mead 5 years, apron askew and her face pale as milk. She ran toward Dr. Haydock's surgery, her cries drawing a small crowd. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's dearest friend, and a woman with a flair for gossip, was among them, hurrying across the green with her scarf trailing. By noon the village hummed with grim news, passed from shop to tea room with the speed of a telegraph. Percival Hawthorne was dead, found slumped in his lantern room, his skull crushed. The murder weapon, a heavy brass telescope, lay beside him, its polished surface marred with blood, the lens smeared as if accusing its wielder. The door to the lantern room had been locked from the inside, though the key was nowhere to be found, and a single window was slightly ajar, letting in the autumn chill. Inspector Craddock, a courteous young man from Scotland Yard, was summoned, but it was Miss Marple's quiet presence that stirred the village's imagination. "If anyone can make sense of this," muttered old Mr. Pye, polishing his spectacles at the Blue Boar, "it's that Miss Marple. Eyes like a hawk, that one." Miss Marple, invited for tea at the vicarage that afternoon, listened as Mrs. Bantry recounted the morning's events with breathless enthusiasm. "It's dreadful, Jane, simply dreadful. Poor Mr. Hawthorne, struck down in his own home, and with his telescope of all things. Sally says she found him when she went to dust the lantern room. The door was locked, but she used the spare key from the kitchen. Can you imagine? A locked room." Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with the thrill of it, though her tone was suitably somber. Miss Marple sipped her Earl Grey, her expression serene but her mind alight. "A telescope," she said softly, "is an unusual choice for a weapon. Heavy, yes, but so very personal. One does not expect a tool of observation to become an instrument of violence. She set her cup down, her fingers brushing the saucer. And the locked door, most intriguing. It suggests either great cunning or great carelessness. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Do you think it was a burglar, Jane? Someone after his research? Haunted now. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. A shadow, she mused, is often more revealing than light. Shadows move with purpose, you see. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of London crimes, where the smallest detail, a footprint, a glance, unraveled the grandest schemes. St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was no stranger to such intricacies. She recalled a case years ago, when a missing button had led her to a thief in the church choir. We must visit Willow Cottage, she said, rising with a sprightliness that belied her age. The lantern room may have more to say. Mrs. Bantry, eager for adventure, agreed, and the two set off, passing the village green where children now played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. Willow Cottage stood at the end of a lane, its garden bursting with late-blooming roses and chrysanthemums. The lantern room gleamed faintly in the afternoon sun, its glass walls catching the light like a jewel. As they approached, Miss Marple noted the neat gravel path, undisturbed save for a single scuff mark near the gate. Someone in a hurry, she observed, her voice barely above a whisper. At the cottage, they were met by Clara Hawthorne, the victim's widowed sister-in-law, who managed the household with a brisk efficiency. Her gray hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her eyes, though red-rimmed, were sharp. "This is a terrible business," she said, ushering them into the parlor. "Percival was careless, always leaving windows open to the damp. I warned him it would lead to trouble." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her gaze settling on Clara's trembling hands. "A great loss," she said. "Had he seemed troubled recently?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "He was always buried in his books or that telescope. I scarcely saw him except at meals." Her tone was clipped, but Miss Marple detected a flicker of unease. As they spoke, Sally Trent appeared, carrying a tray of tea things. The maid's eyes darted nervously, and Miss Marple noted peace have a way of solving themselves. Chapter 2. The Village Gathers. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its polished oak beams and rows of mismatched chairs, was seldom so crowded as it was on the morning of Percival Hawthorne's inquest. The room smelled faintly of beeswax and damp wool, and the autumn light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Villagers packed the seats, their whispers a low hum, like bees before a storm. The news of Hawthorne's murder had spread like wildfire, and St. Mary Mead, for all its pastoral charm, thrived on such moments of collective curiosity. Miss Jane Marple sat in the back row, her knitting bag at her feet, her eyes darting from face to face with the quiet alertness of a sparrow. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, beside her, fidgeted with her gloves, eager for details. "It's like something out of one of your nephew's novels, Jane," she whispered. "A locked room, a telescope, positively theatrical." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly. "Theater, Dolly, is often closer to truth than we think. People play their parts, but they cannot help revealing themselves." Her gaze settled on the front of the hall, where Inspector Craddock, a young man with an earnest demeanor and a neatly pressed suit, stood beside the coroner. Craddock was new to St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple had taken a liking to him. He listened, which was more than she could say for some of his predecessors. The coroner, a stout man with a walrus mustache, called the room to order, and Dr. Haydock took the stand. His testimony was precise. Percival Hawthorne had died from a single, forceful blow to the back of the skull, delivered with the brass telescope found at the scene. The injury suggested the killer had struck with intent, possibly in a moment of rage or calculation. The lantern room's door, he noted, had been locked from the inside, with no key found in the room. A small window, barely wide enough for a man to climb through, was ajar, its latch loose. No signs of a struggle, Dr. Haydock added, adjusting his spectacles. Mr. Hawthorne was likely caught unawares. The villagers met unusual the previous evening. Sally hesitated, then mentioned the shadow she'd seen near the cottage, a vague figure moving in the dusk. "I couldn't say who it was, sir. It was too dark." Miss Marple leaned forward, her needle still. "A shadow," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry. How curious that Sally saw it, yet no one else did. She recalled a similar incident years ago when a maid's tale of a ghost had revealed a poacher sneaking through the vicarage garden. Shadows, she knew, were often flesh and blood. The inquest continued with the introduction of the key suspects, each summoned to Willow Cottage that afternoon for questioning over tea, a civil affair, as was the custom in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, invited by Craddock to observe, arrived at the cottage with Mrs. Bantry, noting the somber air that clung to its rose-scented garden. The parlor was cozy with chintz curtains and a fire crackling, but the tension was palpable. Clara Hawthorne, the victim's widowed sister-in-law, presided over the tea tray with a steely calm. Her gray dress was immaculate, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the glint of a new brooch pinned to her collar, a sapphire, far too costly for a woman of her means. Percival was careless, Clara said, pouring tea with a steady hand. Always leaving windows open to the damp. I told him it would lead to trouble, but he never listened. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind alert. "A great loss," she said. "Did he seem troubled recently, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Clara's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer. "He was always buried in his work," she replied curtly. "I scarcely saw him except at meals." Miss Marple noted the tremor, filing it away like a stitch in her knitting. Next came Leonard Gibbs, the village chemist, a wiry man in his 40s with thinning hair and nervous hands that fidgeted with his watch chain. Gibbs admitted to visiting Hawthorne the previous evening to deliver a sleeping draft. He'd been complaining of insomnia room, his boots muddy and his face flushed. At 19, he was broad-shouldered but shy, his hands stained with soil from the cottage's flower beds. When asked about his whereabouts, he mumbled, "I was prunin' hedges till dark, then home to me ma'am." His alibi was vague, and his eyes avoided Craddock's. Miss Marple, watching closely, recalled a boy in her Sunday school class who'd stammered just so when hiding a friend's misdeed. Loyalty, she thought, or perhaps fear. As the tea concluded, the villagers dispersed, but Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting to the lantern room above. The glass walls gleamed faintly, and she wondered what they had witnessed. Clara's brooch, Gibbs's nerves, Mrs. Marsh's pollen, Tommy's evasions. Each was a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. "People reveal so much," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, "when they think no one is watching." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. You're already unraveling it, Jane. I can tell. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Not yet, Dolly. But every puzzle has a pattern. And I suspect this one is beginning to take shape. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Glass. The morning sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms and dappling the cobbled lanes with patterns of light and shadow. Willow Cottage stood serene at the end of the lane, its rose garden a riot of late blooms. But the glass-walled lantern room atop its roof seemed to watch the village with an unblinking eye. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and her knitting bag tucked under her arm, walked toward the cottage with Inspector Craddock, who had politely invited her to inspect the scene of Percival Hawthorne's murder. The young inspector, though new to St. Mary Mead, had quickly learned to value her insights, a fact that amused Miss Marple as she recalled the skepticism of past policemen. A village spinster, she mused, her lips twitching, is often underestimated, which is precisely why she sees so much. The air was when a vicar's study had been the scene of a theft, the culprit betrayed by a misplaced hymn book. Small spaces, she knew, held big secrets. They climbed the narrow staircase to the lantern room, its oak steps polished to a gleam but creaking softly underfoot. The room itself was a marvel, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of St. Mary Mead, the church spire piercing the sky, the vicarage garden, the distant meadows rolling toward the horizon. A small oak desk stood in the center, cluttered with botanical journals and star charts, their pages curling slightly from the damp air let in by the ajar window. The brass telescope, now cleaned of its grim evidence, rested on a tripod, its lens catching the light like a wary eye. The floor was spotless, save for a faint smudge of yellow pollen on the window sill, and a single rose petal, delicate and crimson, lying near the telescope's base. Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the petal. How curious, she said, adjusting her spectacles. Mr. Hawthorne was a fastidious man, was he not? One would expect his sanctuary to be immaculate. Yet here is a petal, out of place. She bent closer, noting its vibrant hue, so unlike the faded blooms in the garden below. A florist's rose, perhaps, she murmured, her mind turning to Mrs. Evelyn Marsh's shop, where prize roses were a point of pride. Craddock frowned, scribbling in his notebook. Could have blown in through the window, he suggested. But Miss Marple shook her head gently. The wind, Inspector, is rarely so precise. This petal feels deliberate. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a stray leaf in a parlor had led her to a hidden love letter. Clues, she knew, were often the smallest things, overlooked by those too busy to notice. She moved to the desk, her fingers brushing the journals. Their titles spoke of orchids and constellations, a testament to Hawthorne's twin passions. A faint scratch on the desk's edge caught her eye. Barely visible, chrysanthemums. No roses here, she observed, her voice barely audible. Yet a rose petal above. Most intriguing. Craddock, catching her tone, raised an eyebrow. You think it's significant? He asked. She smiled faintly. Everything is significant, Inspector, until it proves otherwise. Back in the parlor, they found Clara Hawthorne arranging tea things with her usual briskness. Her gray dress was severe, but the sapphire brooch gleamed incongruously, catching Miss Marple's eye once more. Mrs. Hawthorne, she said kindly. Did Mr. Hawthorne often receive flowers? A rose, perhaps, from Mrs. Marsh's shop? Clara's hand faltered, spilling a drop of tea. Not that I recall, she said sharply. He wasn't one for sentiment. Probably blew in from the garden. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind filed away the lie, for Willow Cottage's roses were pink, not crimson. Later, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Marsh's florist shop, a charming nook filled with the heady scent of blooms. Mrs. Marsh, her auburn hair slightly disheveled, was trimming stems, her hands quick but nervous. I sent Percival a bouquet last week, she admitted when pressed. But I haven't been to the cottage in days. Miss Marple noted a ledger on the counter, its pages listing orders, and glimpsed an entry for a single crimson rose marked undelivered. A kind gesture, she said, her tone warm but probing. Did he appreciate your flowers? Mrs. Marsh flushed, her fingers twisting her ring. He was polite enough, she mumbled, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. Outside, Miss Marple lingered by the shop's display, where crimson roses bloomed in profusion. The same shade, she murmured, recalling the petal. She thought of Mrs. Marsh's rumored fondness for Hawthorne, whispered about at the Women's Institute. Love, she knew, could be a motive as potent as greed, though often cloaked in softer guises. Her next stop was the village chemist, where Leonard Gibbs was sorting bottles behind the counter. His nervous demeanor had not abated since the inquest. His hands shook as he labeled a vial. Mr. Gibbs, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. You mentioned Mr. a suitor's visits by claiming to see ghosts. Sally, she suspected, knew more than she let on, perhaps out of fear or loyalty. The lantern room with its pollen and petal loomed in her thoughts. The smudge suggested carelessness, the petal intention. Together they pointed to someone who had been there, perhaps not as a visitor, but as an intruder. Clara's brooch, Gibbs's nerves, Mrs. Marsh's rose. Tommy's vague alibi. Each was a thread in a pattern not yet clear. It's like knitting, Miss Marple thought, her fingers deft with the wool. One stitch at a time, and the shape emerges. She sipped her tea, the fire crackling softly. Shadows and secrets, she murmured, her eyes bright. They always leave a trace if one knows where to look. Chapter 4. A Tangled Web. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its thatched cottages and winding lanes, seemed to bask in the gentle glow of autumn. But beneath its serene surface, whispers of murder wove a tangled web. The death of Percival Hawthorne in his glass-walled lantern room had set tongues wagging, and by the third day, theories swirled like leaves in the October breeze. Some villagers, gathered at the Blue Boar over pints of ale, spoke of a vengeful rival from Hawthorne's botanical days, come to steal his orchid research. Others, including Mrs. Price at the post office, whispered of a burglary gone wrong, though nothing appeared missing from Willow Cottage. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly as she sat by her parlor window, listened to these tales with a quiet smile. Gossip, she mused to Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had dropped by for tea, is like a skein of wool, full of knots, but with a thread of truth if you know how to unravel it. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the pins in her bun, was fixed on the locked door of the lantern room. A locked room, she said, her voice soft but deliberate, is never quite as locked as it seems. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago. Evelyn Marsh's florist shop, a charming nook on the high street where roses and chrysanthemums spilled from wicker baskets. The air was thick with the scent of blooms, and a bell tinkled as she entered. Mrs. Marsh, her auburn hair swept into a loose chignon, was arranging a bouquet, her hands quick but unsteady. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her smile tight. "Dreadful business about poor Percival. I still can't believe it." Her fingers twisted a stem, snapping it, and Miss Marple noted the faint smudge of yellow pollen on her sleeve, identical to that found in the lantern room. "A great loss," Miss Marple said kindly, her eyes roaming the shop. "I understand you sent Mr. Hawthorne a bouquet recently. A neighborly gesture, no doubt." Mrs. Marsh flushed, her cheeks rivaling the roses on her counter. "Yes, just a small arrangement," she said, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "He was fond of flowers, you know." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. She glanced at the open ledger on the counter, its pages listing orders in neat script. One entry caught her eye. A single crimson rose, ordered 2 days before the murder, marked as undelivered. "A single rose," she murmured, recalling the petal in the lantern room. "How thoughtful. Did you deliver it yourself?" Mrs. Marsh's hands faltered, scattering petals. "No, I sent it with Sally," she stammered. "But it must not have reached him." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her thoughts were as sharp as ever. People, she reflected, are so careless with their lies, like a dropped stitch that unravels the whole. She thanked Mrs. Marsh and left, the bell tinkling behind her, but not before noting a pair of gardening gloves on the counter, their cuffs embroidered with a faint T.B. Tommy Black's initials, perhaps? Her next stop was the home of Tommy Black, a modest cottage near the village green where his mother, Mrs. Black, was kneading dough in the claimed to be weeding when he was sneaking apples. She smiled at Mrs. Black, her eyes kind but probing. "Did Tommy ever mention seeing anyone near the cottage that evening? A shadow, perhaps, like Sally saw?" Mrs. Black's face tightened, and she busied herself with the dough. "He saw nothing," she said quickly. "Just hedges and dirt, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind filed away the mother's defensiveness. Loyalty, she knew, could be as blinding as love, and Tommy's silence suggested he was protecting someone or something. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple passed the village green, where children played, and old Mr. Pye sat on a bench, feeding crumbs to pigeons. He tipped his hat, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Heard you're poking about, Miss Marple," he said. "They say a stranger was seen near the station the night of the murder. A botanist, maybe, after Hawthorne's secrets." Miss Marple smiled politely, but her thoughts dismissed the rumor. "Strangers," she mused, "are convenient scapegoats. But St. Mary Mead's secrets are rarely so exotic." She recalled a theft at the vicarage, blamed on a passing tramp but traced to a choir boy's greed. Red herrings, she knew, were as common as dandelions in a village. Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking as she reviewed the morning's findings. The rose petal, so carefully placed, suggested a connection to Mrs. Marsh, but her nervousness felt more like embarrassment than guilt. The pollen, matching that on her sleeve, was too convenient, almost as if left to mislead. Tommy's alibi, propped up by his mother's insistence, was shaky, but his youth and loyalty suggested he was shielding someone rather than himself. Clara's brooch, gleaming beyond her means, hinted at greed, while Gibbs's sleeping draft raised questions of timing. And the locked door, its scratched lock, suggested a staged mystery,
a trick to confuse. She thought of Sally Trent's shadow, a fleeting figure in the dusk. Shadows, she murmured, are cast by those who move with purpose.
Unpredictability, like a pattern you only see when you step back. As the village settled into evening, the church bell tolled, and Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "We must look closer," she murmured, "at what lies in plain sight." She thought of the lantern room, its glass walls watching St. Mary Mead like an unblinking eye. Somewhere within its secrets, she knew, was the key to unraveling the web. Chapter 5. The Missing Key. The autumn days in St. Mary Mead unfolded with a deceptive calm, as if the village, with its thatched roofs and blooming hedgerows, could smooth over the jagged edges of murder. Yet beneath the surface of morning teas and church bells, the death of Percival Hawthorne in his glass-walled lantern room continued to cast a shadow. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cozy parlor at Mead Cottage, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, pondered the puzzle with a mind as sharp as the pins in her silver bun. The locked door, the bloodied telescope, the rose petal, the smudge of pollen. Each clue was a stitch in a pattern, and she was determined to see it whole. "The truth," she murmured to herself, sipping tea by her lace-curtained window, "is often hidden in what people overlook, like a dropped stitch that unravels the entire piece." Inspector Craddock, ever courteous, had shared a new discovery that morning, one that sent ripples through the village's gossip. Percival Hawthorne's botanical research, rumored to detail a rare orchid extract with potential medicinal value, was missing from his desk in the lantern room. The villagers, gathered at the post office or the Blue Boar, whispered of fortunes to be made, of rivals who might kill for such a prize. Clara Hawthorne, when questioned by Craddock, had dismissed the papers as scribbles of little worth, her voice sharp as she polished a teapot in Willow Cottage's kitchen. But Miss Marple, invited to join the inspector for another look at the scene, noted the faint tremor in Clara's hands and the gleam of her sapphire brooch, so incongruous with her modest widow's weeds. Worth, she thought, is a matter of perspective, and Clara's perspective seems rather expensive. The walk to Willow Cottage was brisk, the air carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. Miss Marple, her shawl neatly draped, observed the village with her usual acuity. Mrs. Price sweeping her shop steps. Old Mr. The thief was tidy. No signs of a break-in, save for that open window. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the lock on the door. The tiny scratch she'd noted earlier was clearer in the daylight, a delicate mark suggesting a tool, a hairpin perhaps, or a thin blade. "Not a professional job," she said softly, "but a clever one. Someone wanted us to believe the room was sealed." She bent to examine the windowsill, where the smudge of yellow pollen still lingered, though fainter now, as if someone had tried to wipe it away. The rose petal was gone, likely swept up by Sally, but its memory lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Timing, she mused, is everything in a murder. The petal, the pollen, the lock. They all tell a story, but we must read it carefully. She thought of a neighbor in her girlhood, a gardener who'd hidden stolen bulbs under a layer of dirt, only to be betrayed by a single sprout. Clues, she knew, were stubborn things, refusing to stay buried. Back in the parlor, Clara served tea with her usual briskness, though her eyes darted to the staircase as if expecting a ghost. Miss Marple, accepting a cup, asked gently, "Mrs. Hawthorne, did you and your brother-in-law ever discuss his finances? He was a man of means, I understand." Clara's teacup rattled in its saucer, and she set it down with a clink. "Percival was wasteful," she said, her voice tight. "Always spending on his telescopes and plants. I told him it was foolish, but he never listened." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the sapphire brooch, its facets catching the firelight. "A recent purchase?" she asked, her tone innocent. Clara's hand flew to the brooch, her fingers trembling. "A family heirloom," she snapped, but her flush betrayed her. Later, Miss Marple called on Sally Trent, who was polishing silver in the cottage's kitchen. The maid, still pale from the shock of finding Hawthorne's body, jumped at Miss Marple's approach. "Oh, miss, you startled me," she said, her hands twisting her apron. Miss Marple smiled kindly, noting the faint smudge of pollen still filled with the sharp scent of herbs and liniments. Gibbs, his thinning hair disheveled, was labeling bottles, his hands shaking as he met Miss Marple's gaze. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice high, "I've told the inspector all I know. I gave Mr. Hawthorne a sleeping draught, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her question was precise. "Was it a strong dose, Mr. Gibbs? Enough to make him drowsy, perhaps unable to defend himself?" Gibbs swallowed, his fingers fumbling a vial. "It was potent, yes," he admitted, "but not dangerous. He asked for something to calm his nerves. Said someone had been in his papers." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she sat across from him, her knitting a soothing counterpoint to his unease. "His papers," she said thoughtfully. "Did he suspect anyone in particular?" Gibbs shook his head, but his eyes darted to the window where Willow Cottage was just visible. "He didn't say," he mumbled, "just that he felt watched." Miss Marple nodded, filing away his nervousness. A watched man, she thought, is often a vulnerable one, like a bird before a cat. As she left the shop, the village was settling into its afternoon lull, the church clock chiming softly. Miss Marple paused by the green where Tommy Black was raking leaves, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a burden. She approached, her voice gentle. "Tommy, you were fond of Mr. Hawthorne, weren't you? He lent you a book once, I believe." The boy flushed, his rake stalling. "Aye, miss," he said. "A book on stars." He was kind. His eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple noted the soil under his nails, fresh despite his claim of pruning days ago. Loyalty, she thought, can be a heavy weight, like the time my gardener's boy hid a friend's theft to spare him shame. Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision. The missing research, the scratched lock, Clara's brooch, Gibbs's potent draught, those who know where to look. Chapter 6. A False Trail. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and blooming hedgerows, wore the golden hues of autumn like a well-loved shawl, but the murder of Percival Hawthorne had cast a subtle chill over its warmth. The glass-walled lantern room of Willow Cottage, once a beacon of quiet scholarship, now loomed in the villagers' minds as a stage for tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in her parlor at Mead Cottage, pondered the tangled threads of the case with a mind as sharp as the pins in her silver bun. The rose petal, the pollen smudge, the scratched lock, the missing key, the potent sleeping draught. Each was a clue, but some, she suspected, were designed to mislead. A puzzle, she murmured to herself, sipping tea by her lace-curtained window, is only as good as its distractions, and this one has a few too many. The village was abuzz with fresh gossip, fueled by a discovery that morning. A local boy, young Jimmy Price, had found a leather glove tangled in the hedge near Willow Cottage, its cuff embroidered with the initials T.B., Tommy Black's initials. By noon, the news had spread from the post office to the Blue Boar, where villagers speculated over their tea and pints. "It's Tommy, mark my words," declared Mrs. Price, her broom pausing mid-sweep. "That lad's always been shifty, skulking about with those muddy boots." Others, including old Mr. Pye, were less certain, muttering about strangers seen near the station. Inspector Craddock, ever diligent, took possession of the glove, but it was Miss Marple's quiet presence at the village hall that drew whispers. "She'll have it sorted before Craddock's sharpened his pencil," Mr. Pye said, polishing his spectacles with a grin. Miss Marple, invited by Craddock to examine the glove, met him at Willow Cottage, where the air was thick with the scent of roses and the faint tang of wood smoke. The glove, laid out on the parlor table, was pristine, its leather soft and unscuffed, unlike the worn tools in Tommy Black's shed. Miss Marple seemed to point in too many directions. The glove, she suspected, was a red herring, designed to draw attention to Tommy, whose vague alibi and shy demeanor made him an easy target. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple visited Tommy Black at his mother's cottage, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the tang of linseed oil from a newly painted fence. Tommy was in the garden, raking leaves with a vigor that suggested more nerves than industry. His mother, Mrs. Black, hovered at the door, her apron dusted with flour and her eyes wary. "Tommy's done nothing wrong," she said, her voice sharp as she invited Miss Marple in for tea. "That glove's not his. He lost his pair weeks ago, and he's been using mine." Miss Marple smiled kindly, noting the defensiveness in her tone. A devoted mother, she thought, is a powerful shield, but even shields have cracks. Seated at the scrubbed oak table, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting bag at her feet. "Tommy," she said gently, "the glove has caused quite a stir. You're certain you lost yours?" The boy flushed, his hands twisting the hem of his shirt. "Aye, miss," he mumbled. "Dropped 'em somewhere in the village, I reckon. I've been using Ma'am's old ones." He gestured to a pair of worn gloves on the counter, their cuffs plain and unembroidered. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her question was precise. "Did you see anyone near Willow Cottage that evening, Tommy? Someone who might have wanted to point suspicion your way?" Tommy's eyes darted to his mother, who busied herself with the teapot. "Didn't see nothin', miss," he said, his voice low. "Just pruned the hedges till dark, then home." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind filed away his hesitation. She recalled a boy in her Sunday school class who'd stammered just so when hiding a friend's prank. Loyalty, she thought, is a noble trait, but it can blind one to the truth. Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple walked to Mrs. Evelyn Marsh's florist shop, where the air was heavy with the scent of accidental. Mrs. Marsh's nervousness, she suspected, stemmed from embarrassment rather than guilt, perhaps tied to her rumored fondness for Hawthorne. Love, Miss Marple reflected, is a motive as old as time, but it often hides behind shame. As she left the shop, Miss Marple passed the village green where children played and old Mr. Pye fed crumbs to pigeons. He tipped his hat, his eyes twinkling. "Heard about the glove, Miss Marple," he said. "Reckon it's young Tommy's doing?" She smiled politely, dismissing the gossip. People, she thought, are so quick to jump at shadows, like the time they blamed a tramp for stealing the vicar's silver. Red herrings, she knew, were as common as dandelions in St. Mary Mead. Back at Mead cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her needles clicking as she reviewed the day's findings. The glove, too pristine to be Tommy's, was a deliberate misdirection, likely placed to shift suspicion from the true killer. Mrs. Marsh's admission of her visit and the rose strengthened the link to the petal, but her distress suggested innocence, or at least a lesser crime. Clara's brooch, Gibbs's nervous confession about the sleeping draught, Tommy's evasive loyalty. Each pointed to a web of motives, but the glove was a false trail, designed to distract. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, was pursuing the burglary angle, convinced an outsider had climbed through the lantern room's window to steal the research. He'd interviewed villagers about strangers near the station, but Miss Marple, sipping her tea, smiled gently. "The simplest explanation, Inspector," she said when he called that evening, "is rarely the correct one in St. Mary Mead. A burglar would not bother with a glove, nor leave a room so tidy." Craddock nodded, his respect for her growing. "You think it's one of our suspects?" he asked. She tilted her head, her eyes bright. "I think, Inspector, that the truth lies closer to home, like a weed in a flower bed." As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the lantern room, its glass walls a silent witness. The glove, the petal, the scratched St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobbled lanes and gilding the thatched roofs with a soft amber glow. The village, with its rose-scented gardens and chiming church bells, seemed determined to reclaim its tranquility. But the murder of Percival Hawthorne in his glass-walled lantern room lingered like a stubborn fog. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, in her cozy parlor at Mead cottage, pondered the puzzle with a mind as keen as the pins in her silver bun. The rose petal, the pollen smudge, the scratched lock, the pristine glove, the potent sleeping draught, each clue was a thread in a tapestry, and she sensed the pattern was beginning to emerge. "Truth," she murmured to herself, sipping tea by her lace-curtained window, "is like a stitch in knitting. It holds firm only when you see where it connects." The village buzzed with speculation, but Miss Marple's thoughts were drawn to Sally Trent's mention of a shadow near Willow Cottage the night of the murder. The maid's tale, hesitant and vague, had taken on new weight, and Miss Marple resolved to coax more from her. She invited Sally for tea that afternoon, setting out her best china and a plate of scones baked by her housekeeper, Florence. Sally arrived, her apron neatly pressed, but her eyes darting nervously, as if expecting the shadow to follow her. "You've been so brave, Sally," Miss Marple said, her voice warm as she poured the tea. "It must be difficult, working at Willow Cottage after such a tragedy." Sally flushed, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "It's awful, miss," she said, her voice trembling. "I keep seeing him in that room, slumped over with that telescope." She trailed off, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes kind but probing. "You mentioned a shadow, my dear," she said gently. "Can you recall anything more about it? Its shape, perhaps, or how it moved?" Sally hesitated, her gaze fixed on her teacup. "It was like a woman, miss," she admitted at last. "Tall, allowed her another visit, and she climbed the narrow staircase with care, noting the same scuff on the banister she'd seen before. In the lantern room, the oak desk stood as it had, its journals neatly stacked, but the drawer empty of Hawthorne's prized research. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her years, caught a faint irregularity in the desk's paneling, a seam, barely visible, suggesting a hidden compartment. She pressed gently, and with a soft click, a small drawer sprang open, revealing a single sheet of paper covered in chemical formulas, annotated in Hawthorne's precise script. "Not stolen, then," she murmured, her lips twitching with satisfaction. "Hidden." She thought of a vicar's wife in her youth who'd concealed love letters in a secret drawer, only to be betrayed by a loose hinge. The formulas, she suspected, were the key to Hawthorne's orchid research, valuable enough to kill for, or to protect. She tucked the paper into her bag, intending to show Craddock later, and turned her attention to the windowsill, where the pollen smudge had faded but not vanished. A careless clue, she thought, or perhaps a deliberate one. Back in the parlor, Clara Hawthorne was arranging chrysanthemums in a vase, her movements brisk but her eyes wary. Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea, noted the sapphire brooch still pinned to Clara's dress, its gleam a stark contrast to her somber attire. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she said gently, "did you often visit the lantern room? Perhaps to check on Percival's work?" Clara's hand faltered, spilling a drop of tea. "Rarely," she said sharply. "He was private about his scribblings. I had no interest in them." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind lingered on Sally's shadow and Clara's expensive taste. Greed, she thought, is such a persistent motive, like a weed that keeps sprouting. Her next stop was the chemist's shop, where Leonard Gibbs was sorting bottles with a nervousness that had not abated. His thinning hair was disheveled, and his hands shook as he met Miss Marple's gaze. Mr. Gibbs' encounter with Tommy Black, who was carrying a crate of pumpkins. His face flushed as he saw her, and he nearly dropped his load. "Tommy," Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. "You've been loyal to Mrs. Hawthorne, haven't you? Perhaps you saw something that night, near the cottage." The boy's eyes widened, and he stammered. I saw her, Mrs. Hawthorne, by the lantern room stairs, after dark. I didn't want to say 'cause she's been kind to me." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple patted his arm. "Loyalty is admirable," she said, "but truth is kinder." Tommy's confession, reluctant but clear, sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. She recalled a young man in her Sunday school class who'd hidden a friend's misdeed out of loyalty, only to regret it when the truth emerged. Clara, she thought, was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps the right one. The shadow, the hidden formulas, the potent draft, they pointed to a plan, one woven with care but fraying at the edges. Back at Mead cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision. The hidden compartment suggested Hawthorne had feared theft, perhaps from someone close. Clara's presence near the lantern room, confirmed by Tommy, placed her at the scene, and her brooch hinted at a motive rooted in greed. Gibbs's draft, potent enough to render Hawthorne helpless, suggested a calculated act, while Mrs. Marsh's rose felt increasingly like a distraction, a red herring to mislead. "A glimmer of truth," Miss Marple murmured, sipping her tea, "is all one needs to see the whole." She thought of the lantern room, its glass walls a silent witness to the crime. The scratched lock, the hidden drawer, the shadow, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was beginning to see their shape. People, she reflected, are so careless with their secrets, leaving them scattered like petals in a storm. The village, settling into its evening hush, held its breath, as if waiting for her to unravel the final threads. Chapter 8. The net tightens together only when every stitch is in place. Miss Marple had shared her findings with Inspector Craddock that morning, her voice calm but precise as she outlined the clues. The hidden compartment in Hawthorne's desk, containing a single sheet of chemical formulas, suggested the research had not been stolen, but concealed, perhaps out of fear. Sally Trent's description of a woman's shadow near the cottage, resembling Clara Hawthorne, placed her near the scene. The scratched lock hinted at a staged locked-room mystery, while the pristine glove with Tommy's initials was a clear attempt to mislead. Craddock, his notebook filled with her observations, had nodded thoughtfully. "You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple," he said, his respect evident. "But we need proof to pin this down." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes bright. "Proof, Inspector, is often a matter of looking at what's already there." She thought of a case in her youth when a misplaced hairpin had unraveled a theft at the vicarage, its simplicity overlooked by all but her. The lantern room, she suspected, held more secrets, and she resolved to revisit it with Craddock's permission. As they walked to Willow Cottage, the village was alive with its daily rhythm. Children playing on the green, Mrs. Price sweeping her shop steps, the scent of apples drifting from Mr. Pye's orchard. Yet the cottage, with its rose garden and gleaming lantern room, seemed to watch them with a quiet intensity. In the lantern room, the glass walls framed St. Mary Mead like a painting, the church spire and meadows glowing in the fading light. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the room, noting the polished oak floor, the desk with its hidden compartment, and the windowsill where the pollen smudge lingered, faint but stubborn. She bent to examine the telescope, now cleaned of its grim evidence, and noticed a tiny dent in its brass base, as if it had been dropped or swung with force. "A heavy thing," she murmured, "and personal. Not a weapon one chooses by chance." She recalled a gardener in her girlhood who'd used a spade to settle a grudge, its familiarity making it deadly. Craddock Marsh, her auburn hair swept into a loose chignon, was trimming stems, her hands trembling slightly. The ledger on her counter still bore the entry for the undelivered crimson rose, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it. "Mrs. Marsh," she said gently, "you admitted to visiting Mr. Hawthorne, leaving a rose. Can you tell me more about that evening?" Mrs. Marsh's cheeks flushed and she set down her shears with a clatter. "I told you I went to ask for payment," she said, her voice breaking. "He owed me for bouquets. I left the rose as a gesture, nothing more. He was alive when I left, I swear it." Miss Marple noted the pollen on Mrs. Marsh's sleeve, matching that in the lantern room, but her distress seemed genuine, tinged with embarrassment rather than guilt. Love, Miss Marple thought, is a powerful mask, but it rarely hides murder. She recalled a young woman in St. Mary Mead whose flirtations had been blamed for a theft, only to prove innocent when a ledger revealed the truth. "Thank you, Evelyn," she said, her tone kind. "You've been most candid." As she left, she noted a pair of gardening gloves on the counter, their cuffs plain, unlike the embroidered glove found in the hedge. Her next stop was the chemist shop where Leonard Gibbs was sorting bottles with his usual nervousness. His thinning hair was disheveled and his eyes darted as he met Miss Marple's gaze. "Mr. Gibbs," she said, her voice soft but probing. "Your sleeping draught was unusually potent, was it not?" enough to ensure Mr. Hawthorne was deeply asleep. Gibbs swallowed, his hands fumbling a vial. It was strong, yes, he admitted, but he asked for it. Said he hadn't slept in days, that someone was meddling with his papers. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind turning to timing. A drowsy victim, she thought, is a vulnerable one, like a lamb before a shearer. She pressed further, her tone gentle but relentless. Did you ever— His arm, her eyes softening. Truth, she said, is a kindness, even when it hurts. Tommy's confession, coupled with Sally's shadow, placed Clara at the scene, her sapphire brooch a glaring clue to her motives. Miss Marple returned to Mead cottage, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision as she sat by the fire. The hidden formulas, the scratched lock, the potent draft, the planted glove, they pointed to a calculated crime, with Clara as the likely weaver. The rose petal, linked to Mrs. Marsh, was a distraction, its pollen too convenient to be accidental. Gibbs's nervousness suggested fear, perhaps of being implicated, but not murder. Tommy's loyalty, while touching, had delayed the truth, but no longer. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the fire casting soft shadows on the walls. The net tightens, she murmured, when you pull the right thread. She thought of the lantern room, its glass walls a silent witness to Clara's greed. The telescope, a tool of observation, had been turned into a weapon, its weight a symbol of betrayal. People, she reflected, are so careless with their motives, leaving them scattered like leaves in a storm. The village, settling into its evening hush, waited for her to unravel the final knot. Chapter 9. The Lantern Revealed. The twilight of St. Mary Mead draped the village in a soft, violet hush, its thatched cottages and blooming hedgerows glowing faintly under the first stars. Willow Cottage, with its glass-walled lantern room perched like a sentinel, stood at the heart of the village's unease, its once welcoming light now a reminder of Percival Hawthorne's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles stilled for the evening, sat in her parlor at Mead cottage, her mind weaving the final threads of the case. The rose petal, the pollen smudge, the scree pollen smudge, the scratched lock, the hidden compartment, the potent sleeping draught, the planted glove, and Tommy Black's reluctant confession. They were stitches in a lingered in the background, her apron still dusted with faint pollen. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair, her shawl neatly draped, surveyed the room with eyes as sharp as the pins in her silver bun. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle but firm, like a schoolmistress addressing a class. Mr. Hawthorne's death was no accident, nor the work of a passing stranger. It was a crime of calculation, woven with care but undone by carelessness. The suspects shifted, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity, and Craddock, standing by the door, nodded for her to continue. She leaned forward, her hands folded over her knitting bag. "Let us begin with the lantern room," she said, her tone measured. "A locked door, a missing key, a telescope-turned weapon. These were meant to suggest an impossible crime. But impossibilities, you see, are often illusions." She thought of a case in her youth when a locked shed had been breached with a simple hairpin, its mystery unraveling with a single clue. The scratched lock, she continued, was not the work of a burglar, but of someone inside, staging a puzzle to mislead. Her gaze settled on Mrs. Marsh, who flinched. The rose petal, found near the telescope, pointed to you, Mrs. Marsh. Your ledger showed an undelivered crimson rose, and pollen on your sleeve matched that in the lantern room. A clever distraction, perhaps? Mrs. Marsh's cheeks flushed, and she stammered, "I left the rose as a gesture, nothing more. He was alive when I left." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes softening. "I believe you, my dear. Your visit was innocent, though your fondness for Mr. Hawthorne made you a convenient scapegoat." She turned to Gibbs, whose hands trembled. "Mr. Gibbs, your sleeping draught was potent, ensuring Mr. Hawthorne was drowsy, perhaps unconscious, when the blow was struck. You admitted he feared his research was tampered with. Did you know more than you let on?" Gibbs shook his head, his voice high. "I only gave him what he asked for. I swear I didn't harm him." Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Fear, Mr. Gibbs, is a powerful motive. Sleeping draught. Ensuring he was defenseless. You struck him with his own telescope, a weapon you knew well, living under his roof. The key was not missing. You hid it to stage a locked room mystery, scratching the lock to suggest an outsider. But your new brooch, so extravagant for a widow, betrayed your greed." Clara's hands clenched, her eyes blazing. "You have no proof," she snapped, but her voice cracked, and the room fell silent. Miss Marple's eyes were steady. The hidden compartment in the desk held his research, not stolen but concealed, because you knew its value. Sally saw your shadow near the cottage, and Tommy confirmed your presence by the stairs. The pollen and rose petal were distractions, pointing to Mrs. Marsh. But your brooch, purchased days after the murder, tells of a woman who saw wealth within her grasp. Clara's composure shattered, and she sank into a chair, her face in her hands. "He was wasting it all," she sobbed. "The money, the research, he wouldn't share. I only wanted what was mine." Her confession spilled out, raw and broken, as Craddock stepped forward, his expression grim but satisfied. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "you'll need to come with me." He led her away, her sobs echoing in the quiet room. As the suspects exhaled, their relief palpable. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting bag untouched, her eyes bright. "People," she said softly to Craddock, "are so careless with their secrets, leaving them scattered like petals in a storm." She thought of the lantern room, its glass walls a witness to Clara's betrayal. The telescope, a tool of clarity, had been turned to violence, its weight a symbol of her greed. The village, she knew, would soon settle back into its gentle rhythm. But for now, the truth had cast its own light. As the suspects dispersed, Sally lingered, offering Miss Marple a fresh cup of tea. "You're a wonder, miss," she whispered, her eyes wide. Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. Not lace-curtained walls, and outside the church bells chimed, signaling the return of St. Mary Mead's gentle rhythm. "Truth," Miss Marple murmured, setting her teacup down, "is like a well-knitted shawl. Its warmth comes from how every stitch holds together." Mrs. Bantry, her eyes bright with curiosity, leaned forward, nearly upsetting her plate of scones. "Jane, you simply must tell me everything," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "How did you know it was Clara? The lantern room, the telescope, that dreadful locked door. It all seemed so impossible." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Nothing, Dolly. is truly impossible when you look closely, she said. It's the small things, a petal, a scratch, a glance, that tell the biggest stories. She thought of her youth in St. Mary Mead, when a misplaced button had unraveled a theft at the vicarage, its simplicity overlooked by all but her. She sipped her tea, her needles pausing as she began her explanation. "Let us start with the lantern room," she said, her voice calm but precise. "A locked door, a missing key, a telescope-turned weapon. These were designed to create a mystery, to suggest an outsider or an impossible crime. But people, you see, are rarely as clever as they think. The scratched lock, so delicate, was not the work of a burglar, but of someone inside, staging a puzzle. Clara Hawthorne, living under Percival's roof, had every opportunity to tamper with it." Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Clara! But she seemed so proper, so in control." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Control, Dolly, is often a mask for desperation." Clara resented Percival's wealth, his control over the household finances. Her sapphire brooch, so extravagant for a widow, was a clue as bright as the lantern room itself. I noticed it at the inquest, gleaming beyond her means, purchased days after the murder. Greed misled. It was too pristine for a gardener's glove, unlike the worn tools in Tommy's shed. Clara planted it, knowing Tommy's vague alibi made him vulnerable. But Tommy, bless him, was loyal. He saw Clara near the lantern room stairs that night, but stayed silent to protect her, as she'd been kind to him with extra work. She sipped her tea, the fire casting soft shadows on the walls. The sleeping draught, provided by Leonard Gibbs, was the key to the timing. It was potent, ensuring Percival was drowsy, perhaps unconscious, when the blow was struck. Gibbs admitted to delivering it, claiming Percival was agitated about his research. But Gibbs's nervousness was that of a man fearing implication, not a murderer. Clara, however, had access to Percival's tea, a nightly ritual. She laced it with the draught, ensuring he was defenseless when she entered the lantern room. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her scone forgotten. "But the locked room, Jane. How did she manage it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The key was never missing, Dolly. Clara hid it after the murder, scratching the lock to suggest a break-in. She struck Percival with his own telescope, a weapon she knew well, its weight familiar from years in the household. The hidden compartment in the desk, containing his orchid research, proved the papers were not stolen but concealed, likely because Clara knew their value and planned to claim them after his death." She paused, her needles clicking softly. Sally Trent's shadow, seen near the cottage, was the final thread. She described a woman's silhouette, resembling Clara, moving by the roses. Tommy confirmed Clara's presence by the stairs, his loyalty faltering under the weight of truth. These small things, pollen, a scratch, a brooch, a shadow, wove the pattern of Clara's guilt. She confessed when confronted, unable to bear the unraveling of her web. Mrs. Bantry shook her head, marveling. "You make it sound so simple, Jane. But how do you see these things? I'd have suspected Mrs. Marsh or even—" "You're a wonder, Jane," she said. "The Women's Institute will talk of this for years." Miss Marple chuckled, her needles resuming their rhythm. Let them talk, Dolly. It keeps the village lively. But I suspect the lantern room will stay dark for a while, and perhaps that's for the best. She sipped her tea, the fire's warmth enveloping the room, and glanced out the window where the village glowed in the morning light. As they chatted, Florence brought in a fresh pot of tea, her face beaming with pride. "You've done it again, miss," she said, setting the pot down. Miss Marple waved a hand, her expression modest. "Not I, Florence, but the truth. It has a way of shining through, like sunlight through a clean window." She thought of her youth, when a lost earring had revealed a servant's deceit, and of countless cases since, each solved by the smallest details. St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was a tapestry of human nature, its threads as familiar to her as her knitting. The church bells chimed again, and Mrs. Bantry sighed contentedly. "What next, Jane? Another mystery?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "There's always another, Dolly. But for now, let's enjoy our tea." The parlor, with its crackling fire and fragrant scones, was a haven of calm, and Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. The lantern room, once a stage for tragedy, was now just a room, its secrets laid bare by a spinster's quiet wisdom.